I've done 2 positive lists on the best books of this year. 2. Now I get to rant. 20 best books spread across 2 different videos. Now I get to go half insane ranting about 4 terrible books. Let's get into it. In truth, these are not the only 4 bad books that came out this year, but I typically avoid bad books. Often there are books that disappoint me, and one that I've mentioned a few times is Butter by Asuko Yuzuki. That is not on this list because Butter was my most anticipated book of this year, and it turned out to only be okay. It wasn't terrible, it doesn't earn a spot on this list, it just disappointed me. These 4 books are really, really tragic. And the reason they bother me so much is because I am in a big fantasy mood right now. I've been steadily getting into the romantasy genre, and there are plenty of good books within that genre of romantic fantasy. I just keep stumbling into the bad ones. So let's start with the one that upset me the most. A Dark and Drowning Tide by Alison Saft. This thing had me furious. And that's because it offered up everything that I like in fiction. It is proudly sapphic. It is a fantasy approach to dark academia. It has a fairy tale-esque setting. It's blending a lot of different ideas. Dark academia, fantasy, romance, it's queer. What more could I ask for? Well, it turns out what I could have asked for was a good fucking book. A Dark and Drowning Tide is embarrassingly misleading. It does so many things wrong, and I only made it so far into this book before I gave up on it. There are 2 very egregious and strange things about this book. The first is that it is a very tropey enemies to lovers affair. Our 2 protagonists are both mid-20s. They talk and behave like angry, angsty teenagers. It is pathetic. And they're both the star pupils of this perfect professor who is a genius writer, explorer extraordinaire. And Alison Saft seems to think that in order to write a good enemies to lovers story, you just have to have them bicker from page 1. These 2 just go back and forth, teasing each other. It is exhausting. It is not interesting. It is not dynamic. It's just 2 children screaming at each other and disagreeing over everything like petulant babies. And the other really weird thing is the world building. Our protagonist is from a ghetto in this city. It's very much a Jewish metaphor, but what's so weird about it is that the ghetto is empty. In fact, the whole city is empty. There are no people populating this world. It feels like she's the only person from her neighborhood. It feels like the king knows everybody because there's only 10 people. The king is sending a group of explorers on a quest to find some kind of fountain of youth thingy. And the group is made up of like 8 nobles that are all just the king's friends. This one perfect professor explorer extraordinaire and her 2 students who are our enemies to lovers characters. It really feels like Alison Saft forgot to build a world. As you read it, you get the sense that they're walking through an empty white space. There's nothing here. It's like an unfinished video game, or like they're walking through a green screen and they forgot to put anything on the background. It's really odd. It's kind of unsettling. It makes me feel uncomfortable. What should have been a fun, fantastical, sapphic, dark academia tale is in fact 2 squabbling children standing in front of a green screen. I hate this thing so much. Moving away from dark academia and romantasy for a second, another book that really pissed me off this year is Ava Reid's Lady Macbeth. I really thought I was gonna love this book. Macbeth is one of my favorite Shakespeare plays. I know half of the lines in that play off by heart. I have performed in it, I have studied it, I have taught it back when I was a teacher. And a retelling of Macbeth from Lady Macbeth's point of view sounds wonderful, but that is not what you get here. First of all, this is very much advertised, promoted, pushed as a feminist retelling of Lady Macbeth's story. And what we get is, in fact, I would argue, the direct opposite. Lady Macbeth is famously a pretty feminist character. She is her husband's puppet master. She is the true evil of that play. Well, maybe the witches are the true evil. Anyway, she is a dark and twisted monster. She gets very little backstory. She is just an evil thing that slowly unravels and goes mad throughout the course of the play. She is corrupted by her own avarice. She is strangled by the strings that she uses to manipulate her husband. She is such an exciting, powerful, evil figure. And what does Ava Reed do with this character who is already such a feminist badass? She just ruins her. She makes her a meek and pathetic little thing, subject to the whims of a husband who is a brutal tyrant. I live in Scotland, by the way. I love it to pieces. I am gonna live here probably forever. And this book frames Scotland as a dangerous, rugged land of barbarian men, bloodthirsty, brutal idiots. It's not very nice. And Lady Macbeth is this meek little French lady who is carted off to Scotland, and she sits and feels sorry for herself while her husband goes off and acts out roughly the plot of Macbeth, while she sits at home in the castle feeling sad and frightened. She's also unusually pale and beautiful, and she always has a veil over her face because men are intimidated by her beauty, and there's some curse about how she's turning people mad with her beauty, etc. It's all so vapid and shallow and pathetic. How in the world is this a feminist retelling? It is a book that removes the feminist intrigue of Lady Macbeth, removes her agency, removes her power, makes her a meek, pathetic, passive little creature, and goes, yeah, feminist retelling. What do you think women are, Ava Reed? What do you think feminism is? This is an insult, plain and simple. Now let's go back to romantasy, because I just read this book. I did a video on it only a few days ago. Check it out if you want to know my thoughts in more detail. But this thing is fascinating in its badness. It's a very curiously strange thing. See, Quicksilver by Callie Hart, just to look at it, if you were to judge it by its cover, it looks atrocious. It looks cheesy and cringe and awful. And then you read the first few pages, as I did, and you go, oh, hang on, can't judge a book by its cover. This is good. This is fun. I'm enjoying this. Wow, I'm getting lost in it. Pages are flying by and I'm having fun because this is an interesting and dynamic world. Our protagonist is an Aladdin-esque young woman who steals from the rich in order to look after herself and her brother in their poor neighborhood. She has fun quips with the guards, she steals from them, and eventually she is thrust into an audience with the queen because she's been caught doing some nasty stuff. It's an engaging world. It has a few mysteries that it sets up. Our protagonist is a lovable rogue. She sits somewhere between Aladdin and Robin Hood, and I'm having a lot of fun reading her exploits. So what does Callie Hart do to ruin all of this? What does she do around 100 pages in? She whisks our protagonist off to a fairyland. It goes from being a half-decent fantasy novel to a fan fiction of A Court of Thorns and Roses. It is embarrassing. Everything that was interesting about this book until this point, including our protagonist, it all gets flushed away. Suddenly, she's in a magic fairy place, which she was stolen into by this guy, who is an abusive and cruel man. And she goes from being a confident, roguish woman to a sad, pathetic little simp who shivers with excitement every time this guy says something abusive to her. It's utterly pathetic. I cannot believe that Callie Hart had the confidence, the nerve to write 100 pages of a half-decent fantasy book only to ruin it. Just tear all of that up and go, nope, this is actually just A Court of Thorns and Roses, but even more cruel, even more abusive, and our protagonist is no longer a fun rogue, she's just some little simp. I hate this thing. And finally, we get the worst book of 2024, a book I couldn't even get 100 pages into. And yeah, it is another romantasy book, When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker. This thing is truly embarrassing. I cannot tell you how awkward and ashamed I felt reading it. And it all comes down to the writing. This is a book written by a thesaurus. Every single page, paragraph, sentence, is bloated by flowery and yet empty language that means nothing and goes nowhere and serves no purpose. To the point that you cannot read it. You can't make sense of what is being said at any given time. I don't know how people get through this thing. It is nothing but a barrage on your senses. Just an overwhelming white noise of words and sentences that the author must think sound clever, sound beautiful, eloquent, poetic. It reads like it was written by someone who is secretly Oscar Wilde's evil twin. Someone who only thinks they're clever, thinks their language is beautiful, thinks that they have a coherent and confident understanding of the power of the written word. And she just vomits all of this awful, empty, vapid nothingness onto the page over and over and over again for hundreds of pages. A book that is absolutely chock full of unreadable nonsense. She must have thought she'd written something beautiful and eloquent and smart, and she hasn't. It is unreadable, empty, shallow nothingness. I am so offended by this thing, and I know right now I am venturing into being mean. I know that I am at risk of sounding too harsh, too cruel, but I cannot stress enough how offensively pretentious the language in this book is. It has insulted me as a reader. It insults your intelligence. You are better and smarter as a reader than this book. It is offensive and patronizing in its demeanor, and I am truly abhorred by it. There you go. I hope you enjoyed my slew of mini rants about really, really terrible books. These were all books that I went into hoping I was going to enjoy them. Lady Macbeth was a real surprise. I thought for sure I was going to love that thing. When the Moon Hatched could have gone either way, and it was bad. Quicksilver, I picked it up and thought this looks terrible, and then was pleasantly surprised by what I read until I wasn't, until the author ripped up all of my expectations, everything that I was enjoying, and went, fooled you, this is actually shit. What is going on with these books? Why are these authors doing this? I feel like so many of them are just cashing in on the popularity of things like Fourth Wing and A Court of Thorns and Roses. And it seems to be working well for them. They're definitely making money. And their books are really, really bad. But I'm not done with romantasy yet. I have read one very, very, very good romantasy book. Feybound. And I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep exploring this genre. I'm going to find the good stuff, and I'm going to talk about it because I know it's out there. Wish me luck. If you enjoyed this, you can show your love by supporting me on Patreon. Merry Christmas. Subscribe for books.